An Odd Boy, Volume 1, by Ngak'chang Rinpoche, Chapter 3, Part 3. Sometime later, maybe in 62-63, the last year of our time at junior school, Steve's Uncle Stan died suddenly and unexpectedly. It was a yachting accident as far as I remember. He'd got carried out to sea in a light boat and was never seen again. Steve was quite upset at losing his Uncle Stan because they were close. Uncle Stan had played in an amateur jazz band, like some early version of the Sultans of Swing. He was doing more than all right. He had a lucrative profession. I think he was a tax accountant or something, because he had a Gibson EBO bass. He also had a new Hagstrom Coronado 6 that was his pride and joy. The Hagstrom, a 6-string bass, was the ugliest contraption I'd ever seen. It looked as if someone had made it from parts that were designed for other electric guitars and washing machines. It was as if you'd combined a Mini Cooper S, a Volkswagen Beetle and a Rolls-Royce. It had a strange diagonal set of buttons that reminded me of my father's Philips tape recorder, a battleship of a device. Mark inherited the Hagstrom, but he was never that excited about it. Mark found it difficult to play. The strings were set closer than those to which he was accustomed, so the Hagstrom just sat in his room along with the Gibson EBO, Martin acoustic, and what might have been a Dan Electro. I grew to like that monstrous Hagstrom by the time I was 16. You just had to admire its ungainly qualities, along with its undoubted high quality. It is a Viking guitar when all's said and done. Hagar the Horrible probably strapped one on his back when he came to pillage the English coast in 1001 AD. It had the same weird Art Deco feel as the National Tricone, but without the elegance or shimmering beauty. The Hagstrom, with its antebellum feel, seemed perfect for blues. Eventually, Mark turned 17 and obtained his first car. He lost interest in music overnight. Motor car racing became his obsession, and Steve inherited the guitars. Steve was enraptured, and so was I, even though I had no guitar myself. He'd suddenly got more guitars than you could shake a stick at. I can't believe anyone would want to give up music, I said to Steve. No, neither can I, Steve replied. Even though a car's something that you absolutely have to have at some point. If we have a band, we'll have to be able to drive and get our equipment to the place we're going to play. Steve's father was also a member of the jazz band. He played a variety of guitars, including a Rickenbacker and an early 1950s Fender Precision bass, and a few other guitars that I can't remember. They were a musical family. Mrs. Bruce played piano extremely well, but she didn't play in the band. She was mainly interested in classical music and played Chopin's nocturnes. I wished my father had some interest in playing music and thought it would have helped him be less angry about the world and everything in it. I knew he'd have been shocked if he'd known that Mr. Bruce was a jazz aficionado who played electric guitar, so I said nothing about it. Mr. Bruce listened to the Dixielanders. The Bruces had apparently lived in Barnhurst, Kent, and later at Bexley Heath, where Mr. Bruce heard a great deal of jazz. The jazz band played trad jazz. Mr. Bruce would sometimes play for us, and I'd watch his fingers intently as if I could pick something up by osmosis. He played Acker Bilk, Chris Barber, and a host of names who were popular in Britain in the late 50s and early 60s. I liked what Mr. Bruce played well enough, and I admired his skill. But Kenny Ball's Midnight in Moscow was not Big Bill Broonzy by any means. I had my eye on that Gibson EBO, but Steve was not sure that buying it was possible. His parents would have to agree. We talked together about ways and means, including the idea of weekly payments. I chopped wood, mowed lawns, and ran errands for neighbours, so I knew I could earn at least £1 a week. It had been his uncle's guitar, however, and Mr. Bruce was very close to his brother. They'd shared an interest in jazz that went back a long way. They'd even thought of turning professional at one time, but that was not the thing to do if you wanted a family life. It struck me then that sacrifice was required if you wanted to be a bluesman. I decided that I was up for that. And anyhow, all that workaday business was time-consuming. Kind enough to offer to sell it. After a weekend in which they observed me fooling around on the EBO, they could see I practically worshipped the thing. I was their son's best friend, and Steve preferred his father's Fender Precision bass, so I think they felt moved to put me on a par with Steve. It must have seemed as if I was always playing second fiddle, sans fiddle. They wrote a letter to my parents the Monday following that weekend to offer the guitar for sale. But my father wouldn't have an electric guitar in the house, even if I bought it in instalments with my own money. My father eventually found out that Mr. Bruce played guitar. He evidently found it perplexing that a policeman would play in a jazz band, even as a recreational pursuit. But although he'd said nothing offensive about it, it didn't change his mind about anything. He must have slotted Mr. Bruce and jazz into two separate conceptual compartments, because I was still allowed to go and stay with the Bruce family for weekends. Steve only came to stay at my home once, and he disliked my father so much he never came again. He was alarmed by how fat and florid my father was, and thought I was pretty brave to be cheerful in spite of him. I replied, "He's all right sometimes. He can even be fun if he's in a good mood," but agreed with Steve that my situation wasn't easy. The Bruces grew more affectionate toward me after that event, and went out of their way to make sure I had a good time. Being around guitars was all the good time I needed, and so I made the most of any musical opportunity that presented itself. Mr. Bruce asked me what kind of music I liked, and was surprised when I said Big Bill Broonzy, Robert Johnson, Leadbelly, Bessie Smith, Memphis Minnie, Ma Rainey, and Big Mama Thornton. He thought that music was quite old and was surprised that a young person would like that kind of music. I told him, "It's my favourite music, but I also like Wagner and the Beatles." Mr. Bruce found that an intriguing mixture. I described the Beatles' music as being thicker and said that it seemed to have more layers. I said that I'd like to know how they did that, and Mr. Bruce told me that they sang in harmony. "Does that mean their voices make chords?" I asked, and he told me I was right. "This whole music thing is fantastic. There's so much to learn. You could spend your entire life with music." The Bruces had a stereogram, a 6-foot cabinet with a speaker at each end, and whatever you played on that thing sounded better than anything I had ever heard before. On a thing like that, I could listen to Midnight in Moscow, and it became captivating, even though I didn't particularly like the trumpet. I had trumpets pegged as military instruments. My father liked military band music, and so I had some degree of prejudice against anything of that nature. I did like the way the music swelled up in that number, though, and told Mr. Bruce that it was the best part of Midnight in Moscow. I enjoyed hearing Mrs. Bruce on piano and wished that we still had a piano in our house. She played me classical pieces, Brahms, Beethoven, Liszt, Mozart, and modern composers like Erik Satie. I loved the gymnopédies and found them wonderfully haunting. It was amazing to me that such different kinds of music existed and that you could like them all. What my father had told me was definitely untrue. You could like Wagner and blues. You could like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. There was no need to cramp yourself with laws that told you what you were allowed to like. Mrs. Bruce liked it that I enjoyed classical music. It was seen as a good influence on Steve, who was more interested in his father's music. Having pestered for a guitar since the age of 7, and having been denied an extremely reasonable deal on a Gibson and amplifier at the age of 9, the death of Mr. Love and the question of his blues bequest may have ultimately prompted lenience toward a guitar entering the moral bastion of our home. I finally got a guitar for my 10th birthday. It was plastic. The neck and frets were mould cast, and it had 4 strings. The strings were tuned by pegs that slipped, and the strings were not even strings. They were hollow lengths of plastic that didn't even sound like nylon strings. It was called the Skiffle Junior and had a picture of a fellow with a quiff who could have been modelled on Elvis Presley. The shape into which the paper illustration had been inserted showed other models boasting an image of Mickey Mouse. I was aghast, but had to look grateful and pleased. I had to look pleased even though the word skiffle meant watered-down blues as far as I was concerned. But my father had no way of knowing that. Skiffle was one of those attempts to repackage black music for white audiences. And even at the age of 7, I'd wanted no part of that. Whenever I touched that plastic guitar, I could see Big Bill Broonsey sneering at it from wherever he was. Then, to make matters worse, I had to dress up in a gawky faux tweed suit and pose with the wretched thing. I told my mother, confidentially, that you needed 6 strings to be able to play proper chords like the ones I learnt from Steve Bruce. She raised her eyebrows sadly and said, "Your father does not want you to take the guitar seriously. He says your school reports are bad and a real guitar would be a distraction. He says you need to improve your arithmetic and that music would not lead to employment. It would be a waste of time." "I do not agree that it would be a waste of time, Victor, but your father is right about your school reports. Maybe if your arithmetic improves, he might change his mind." Yes, really, if I grew another head or a third ear. Arithmetic and the odd boy were not designed to interface with each other. My future as a bluesman was not looking wonderful. Steve Bruce had a real guitar. He'd received lessons since he was 5. I'd have been content with the very worst second-hand, low-end instrument. Naturally, I wasn't inspired to play this plastic apology for a musical instrument, and that was taken as sure proof that a real guitar would have been wasted on me. Steve was quite angry about the plastic guitar and told his parents about it. He told me they seemed a little upset on my behalf and that he'd heard them talking in the kitchen after he'd gone to bed. They'd talked about simply giving me the Gibson EBO, but they'd decided that they couldn't give it to me against my father's wishes. They'd then had another idea. They'd give it to me once I was 18, because then, legally, I'd be an adult and there'd be no problem with their giving it to me as a birthday present. I was not supposed to know this, but the deal was sealed. 7 years and it would be mine. That didn't seem so far away, as I'd be going to Netherfield Secondary School in a matter of months. I felt as if the most violently voluminous fairy godmother in the entire universe, a combination of Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey and Big Mama Thornton, had just grinned at me very, very, very broadly.